Over the last few weeks, life as we knew it has forever changed. The ways in which we interact with each other and our circumstances have changed dramatically. In order to protect others, our families, and ourselves, we have found it necessary to isolate from one another. The threat of a virus that we cannot see has permeated our everyday living. We have stopped worshiping together. We have avoided crowds, and on the few times that I have shopped, I have noticed that people don't even seem to want to make eye contact anymore. The stores have empty shelves, and this is a sight that we don't often experience in the United States. And this threat has already affected people's livelihood, their ability to care for themselves or for their loved ones. So much has changed in such a short amount of time. So much has changed since we began this season of Lent. Our Lenten journey began with an examination of our own human struggles, our struggles for grace, mercy, and justice. But it also began with looking at our need and our desire for freedom, for hope, and for love. We have examined these needs through the lens of the biblical stories that we have looked at over these past few weeks, and also through the story of the novel Les Miserables. When we began this journey, we first heard about the character Jean Valjean, a convict who found justice not in the law, but rather found justice in the offer of divine grace freely given to him through Bishop and Benvenu. As a result of this grace, Jean Valjean is transformed in that story into a man of great compassion, integrity, and he becomes a man of means. His transformation also included a name change, and Jean Valjean became Monsieur Madeleine. He establishes a factory in a small village. He cares for those in the village. He reaches out, he sees their stories, he sees their pain, and he responds with grace and compassion. He would later go on to become mayor of this little town. The final week that we were able to meet physically together, we also met the character Javert, a police inspector who is driven by justice. Javert unwaveringly follows the very letter of the law. There is no variation. He holds to a really strict understanding of the law, its interpretation, and how he carries that out. For Javert, there is no room for compromise, no room for grace, no room for mercy. He believes that grace and mercy threaten justice. That's what he believes. And he is on a mission not only to uphold justice, but he is on a mission to find Jean Valjean and to make him pay for his crimes. This week, we meet the character Fantine. Fantine, and when we first meet her in this story, is an attractive and naive young woman. She comes from modest beginnings, but she's also able to enjoy some freedom and leisure that is enjoyed in the upper classes. In the summer of 1817, the author tells us that Fantine and several other friends enjoy a time of some carefree fun. And during this time of fun, she falls in love with Felix, a young aristocrat who sweeps her off her feet, and together they have a child, a daughter, and her name is Cosette. It isn't long, though, before Felix decides that he really doesn't want anything to do with raising a child, and he leaves Fantine with nothing and returns to his parents' estate. Fantine is, of course, heartbroken. But out of love, a deep and abiding love for her child, she decides that she has to find a way forward, and that includes finding work. On the way to start a life for her and her child, she seeks lodging in the inn of a couple, the Thénardiers. Believing and trusting that they are kind people, Fantine asked them to keep Cosette until she has secured employment and housing for the two of them. This is an unfortunate choice, as the Thénardiers are corrupt, selfish, and cruel people. Fantine separates herself from her beloved child in order to care for her. Eventually, Fantine is able to find work in that small, tiny village in Jean Valjean's factory. But it isn't long before the Thénardiers begin to extort Fantine for greater and greater funds. They pretend that Cosette is ill and in need of treatment, and therefore she must send the money. Fantine eventually loses her position at the factory when a corrupt manager discovers that she has an illegitimate child. Fantine, from this point forward in the story, begins to slip deeper and deeper into debt. She does this so that she is able to pay the Thénardiers exorbitant requests for money for Cosette's care. She becomes desperate. Fantine is so desperate that she sells her hair and her two front teeth. And she resorts, in the end, to prostitution to pay the Thénardiers for Cosette's care. She is no longer naive, no longer a beautiful young woman that she once was. People only see her now as a sinful woman. They don't know her circumstances. They don't see her love for her daughter that compels her to do whatever is necessary to care for Cosette and to survive. The disciples, upon seeing Jesus with the woman at the well, the first thought that comes into their minds is, why are you speaking to her? Why are you speaking to her? They've already judged this foreign woman and found her wanting. Now, these are some of the same verses that we read from last week, and from last week's homily, we read how this woman was perceived and judged, not just in that moment by the disciples, but by theologians and preachers who would come long after that. Over the centuries, we've heard very little about this woman's circumstances, but we have heard a great deal about her perceived sin. Jesus told the woman that she had had 5 husbands, that the man that she was living with now was not her husband. And you know, our modern minds, I'm sure that when we hear details like this, we probably have reached a couple of conclusions about this woman. I'm thinking that perhaps what came to my mind, and maybe perhaps some of yours, was we think of this woman as the Zsa Zsa Gabor of the 1st century. But what are these circumstances that we know so little about, that we don't hear about this woman, and how it brought her to this well with this conversation with Jesus? During this particular time in history, women, you see, don't have the right to divorce. Only men had that right. These are part of the circumstances that have influenced this woman's life. Her former husbands most likely had either divorced her or they had passed away. She also could have been abandoned. And as for her present circumstances, with the man that she is with now and not married to, the truth is that it's most likely she was residing with the male relative of her husband's family because that was the cultural norm. A widow, someone left behind, a woman left behind, was to be taken care of by her deceased husband's family. This is a woman who is deeply dependent upon this man who is not her husband in order to simply survive. But Jesus sees this woman. He knows her circumstances and her challenges. And although Jesus knows everything about this woman's life, do we not hear in the scripture that there's no mention of sin or sinfulness, no word of judgment from Jesus? an encouragement to change her life, we don't hear any of this. Jesus doesn't exclude the woman. He doesn't ignore her. He doesn't push her aside. He doesn't assume that she is sinning. Instead, he sees her and he names her circumstances honestly. He shows her understanding. And at a great cost, he offered her living water. Jean Valjean also made a choice. He chose, like Jesus, to see Fantine, to see past her circumstances and to hear the story about her deep love for her child, a child from whom she was separated. A great risk is what Jean Valjean put himself at by helping Fantine. He put himself at great risk of being caught by Javert and imprisoned. But this doesn't stop Jean Valjean. He chooses to find Fantine's daughter Cosette and to care for her like his very own. Jean Valjean also saw how the circumstances had oppressed and impoverished Fantine, and he offered to give her what he could. The disciples, Jesus' own followers, they had a very different reaction. They wanted to exclude the woman at the well. In fact, all Samaritans. They didn't want to hear that Jesus had a different plan in place. For them, living water was something that was meant to be hoarded and only kept for those they believed worthy. We are living at a time when we're seeing hoarding of resources. We are living at a time when we are isolated physically from one another, from those we love, and from those in our community because we want to care for them in the best ways possible. But being isolated and being separated, it makes it much more difficult to see another person's circumstances. But in times like these, when we're feeling alone and we're feeling isolated, we must remember and trust that God indeed sees our struggles. It is also a time when God, in the midst of seeing our struggles, asks us to open our eyes a little bit wider to see the struggles of another person. It is a time when we are also called to offer living water to those around us. And while, as our tradition as disciples, we share a common cup around a common table, and although we cannot do this at this time, we can, however, decide to extend the cup of mercy, the living water, to those around us. Amen.